She sat as if carved from eternity, a goddess untouched for countless ages, built to be worshipped, never to be loved. But when a small, green-skinned boy brushed his tiny fingers against her thigh, her breath shattered the silence like breaking glass. "He carries my pattern," Leora murmured, her voice low and fragile. But I was never allowed to breathe. Kale, crouched in the frost beside her, tilted his head, watching her with quiet intensity. "Then why?" he asked gently. "Does he only stop crying when you're near?" She stayed motionless beneath the jagged arch of blue ice, the child nestled in her lap, her gaze distant and unblinking. Kale stared at her like a man who had stumbled upon a question he didn't dare speak aloud. At last, her luminous white eyes blinked slowly, not with power but with memory, and she whispered, "They called me sacred before I even knew what that word meant." Leora glanced down at her own body, her form impossibly sculpted like ancient marble, her metallic suit clinging to curves that had never known closeness. "My kind harvested fertility from us, enhancing our lines, turning us into icons," she continued bitterly. "We were forged not to feel, only to inspire. I was made into a vessel, not a being." Her breath coiled into the frozen air like a prayer she could barely voice. "I was never touched. Not in warmth, not in want. My body is a cage made of worship." Kale lowered himself to his knees beside her now, the cold wind tugging at his cracked armor, his movements slow and respectful. "You really think being sacred means you don't deserve to be needed?" he asked, his tone quiet, almost pleading. She finally turned her head, the smallest motion, but her glowing eyes fixed on his, a warning centuries deep. "Do not want me, Kale," Leora murmured, her words heavy with something that sounded almost like grief. "It will hurt you." But he didn't move away. Instead, he reached out and placed his hand over hers, his fingers small and warm against her massive, trembling ones. "You don't scare me," he said, his voice hoarse yet steady. "You break my heart." Something flickered behind her expression then, and her lips parted slightly, as though the weight of his words had cracked something inside her. From the palm of her hand, a faint glow began to ripple, climbing up her arm and into her chest, like heat awakening beneath armor that had never been undone. The child giggled softly, and this time she didn't flinch. Kale stayed there beside her in the quiet of the tundra hollow, the mist dancing around them like the ghosts of unspoken questions. Thalen. That was the child's name, though no one had yet dared say it aloud, played between them, scooping up handfuls of snow that shimmered faintly with each happy exhale. Leora watched Kale like she didn't quite believe he was real. "He carries my sequence," she murmured finally, her hand hovering close to the child's head, but not quite touching. "But I have never released. I have never merged with anyone." Her body pulsed faintly, waves of bioluminescence rippling across her hips, her chest, her abdomen, sacred zones long sealed away by protocol and ritual. Kale swallowed hard. "When I found him," he said, his voice low, "he was inside one of your people's fertility chambers. I thought it was just a storage vault until I cut my hand trying to move the cryocore." Her eyes flared, sharp and brilliant. He nodded quickly. "My DNA must have triggered something. I didn't know, I swear." Leora leaned forward, massive yet graceful, until their faces were only inches apart. Her breath was hot against his cheek as she whispered, "You did not take me." One hand pressed lightly to her own stomach. "You gave to me." The silence that fell between them then was the kind that comes before transformation, deep and unrelenting. Thalen toddled forward and pressed both his tiny hands to Leora's chest, and the glow that erupted from her skin was brighter than anything Kale had yet seen, pulsing out from the boy's palms into the woman's body. Leora gasped, her back arching, her breath trembling. Kale caught her shoulder. "What's happening?" he asked sharply. "The bond," she whispered, her voice uneven, awed. "It's stabilizing. He's choosing me." Thalen looked up and smiled, and in that instant, the woman who had never been allowed to be touched felt something awaken beneath her armored skin, a heartbeat that was no longer hers alone. Later, they found shelter in the narrow cleft of a crystal vein where geothermal heat radiated softly through the stone. Mist curled around them, casting silvery light across her body, tracing her shimmering suit like divine brushstrokes. She stood facing the wall, her back to him, her long silver braids spilling over her shoulders like a ceremonial rope unraveling. When she spoke, her voice was low, not ashamed, not afraid, just painfully honest. I was taught to still my breath, to silence longing before it could become hunger. Desire was for lesser forms. I was a symbol, never a being. Kale sat behind her on the warm stone, legs folded, his gaze steady, kind. He didn't interrupt, he simply waited. Slowly, Leora turned and knelt before him, massive and powerful yet trembling, her glowing eyes darting from her own chest up to his mouth. "When you speak, when you look at me, I feel heat under my skin," she whispered. "I dream of your hands. I wake aching." Kale stood and stepped closer. With quiet reverence, he removed one glove from her wrist, then the other, and brought her enormous hand to his lips, kissing the back of it softly. "You think desire makes you impure," he murmured, "but I think you've never been more alive than you are right now." Her breath caught audibly. "Touch me again," she whispered, her voice shaking now, dark with something raw and new. "And I will not be divine anymore." Kale leaned in, his forehead nearly brushing hers. His answer was quiet, steady. "I don't want your divinity. I want your need." Her pulse glowed visibly beneath her skin as her giant fingers, trembling, rose to graze his cheek, and she let herself feel alive. The mist thickened around them, curling like breath that had waited centuries to be exhaled. Hunger burned in the space between them now, because holiness had finally become human. She stood before him, massive and trembling, faintly glowing under the rising haze, her silver bodysuit shimmering like starlight, but clinging now more to her skin than to her pride. One breath, another. Then, voice cracking the silence, she whispered, "Undo me." Kale's hands rose slowly, reverently, as if approaching a temple for the very first time. His fingers found the hidden clasp beneath her collarbone, and with a quiet metallic sigh, the suit peeled away, parting with a rush of warmth and curling steam. Cool air kissed skin that had never known touch, and for the first time in his life he was silent, because what he saw was more than beauty. She was vast, carved like a goddess, alive like a storm. Her breasts rose and fell with breath, bare and full beneath the glowing cave light, her hips broad and strong, her thighs thick with restrained power. "Am I too much?" she asked, voice breaking at the edges. Kale stepped closer, cupping her face in both hands, and whispered against her lips, "You are everything." Then she kissed him, not careful, not hesitant. It was heat, it was ache, it was centuries of starvation poured into one divine collision. He worshipped her slowly, tracing her lines with lips and fingertips. She gasped as his mouth found the soft underside of her breast, whimpered when he moved lower, deeper, his hands steady on her trembling hips. When he entered her at last, her entire body ignited, pulses of light running down her spine as she arched and moaned, clinging to him like a tide refusing to retreat. "You've made me fertile," she gasped, shivering not with life, but with want. And Kale only pressed deeper, murmuring against her skin, "Then let me give you more than worship." Holiness became hunger. The warmth of them together hadn't even faded when the world turned cold again. A low pulse vibrated through the stone. Mechanical, sharp, relentless. Leora sat up, instinct rising inside her like ancient fire, her eyes flaring white. "They know," she hissed. Kale froze. "Who?" She stood tall, radiant now with another kind of energy, her braid lashing behind her like a silver whip. "The BioArch," she said, her voice a mix of rage and resignation. "The Order of Resonance, my people's sacred guardians." She pressed her palm to the crystal embedded beneath her collarbone, and it blinked red, a signal of violation. "They've detected unauthorized resonance within me. They will come, not to question, to cleanse." Kale's arms instinctively wrapped around Thalen, pulling the boy close. "Then we leave." But Leora shook her head, fury blazing in her gaze. Running would only prove them right. They'd call me corrupted. They'd call him a threat to divine purity. They'd offer forgiveness if I surrendered you both. Kale stepped in front of her, voice steady despite the storm building behind his eyes. "You don't have to prove anything to them." But she stepped past him, her stare fixed on the distant lights of the ice plains, eyes blazing like suns. "No," she said, her voice a vow. "But I will." She reached for her ceremonial staff, a weapon never meant for blood, and it crackled with raw energy in her grip. "I will not be their temple anymore." Kale's hand found her arm, gentle. "What will you be?" Her gaze softened for just a moment, meeting his. "A mother, a mate, a woman who chooses herself." The mist parted, and the elders of the BioArch stood beyond it, their glowing eyes cold, their weapons drawn, and not one of them smiling. They had one night left before judgment. Outside, the elders prepared their doctrine, their instruments, their accusations. Inside the crystal chamber, the three of them lay wrapped in silence and thermal mist. The woman, the human, and the child whose very existence defied the design of the universe. Leora looked across the soft light at Kale. They will try to cleanse my body, break my mind, take him. They'll have to go through me first. But she shook her head. No. I want them to see who I've become before they try to erase her. She rose then, towering and luminous, and slowly unsealed the last fragments of her bodysuit. Merge with me again, she said, her voice low and steady. But this time, fully. Kale rose, shedding what was left of his armor until only his skin met hers, cold against radiant heat. She wrapped around him like a solar storm, her hands trembling despite their power, her lips trailing fire down his neck, his chest, his hips. Their bodies moved in perfect rhythm, but it wasn't just touch anymore. It was mind. It was memory. When they climaxed, her bioluminescence surged in a violet wave that lit the chamber like a supernova. She cried out, not in pain but in release, and the crystals above responded, flaring with the same pulse that now lived in the child. Something ancient inside her awakened, and in his arms she saw herself for the first time. Not as a vessel, not as a code, but as a woman. Tears streaked down her cheeks as she clung to him, whispering through ragged breath. You made me sacred, but never small, never silent. The baby stirred in her arms, glowing faintly with their shared resonance, and she lifted her chin toward the distant arena and murmured, Let them see us now. They cannot unmake what we've become. When dawn came, the judgment arena glowed pale beneath the sky, the circle of elders standing in their ritual formation, their blades sheathed in polished steel, their eyes cold with conviction. At the center stood Leora, wrapped in nothing but a ceremonial mantle that left her powerful shoulders bare, her braid gleaming silver, her eyes unwavering. Kale stood beside her, shirtless, bruised, unarmed, but unafraid, and in her arms, wrapped in warmth and truth, Thalin, the child they called impossible. One elder stepped forward, voice sharp and certain. This child carries human corruption. But Leora only smiled, her voice carrying like thunder through the crystal hall. No, this child carries choice. And today, so do I. And proof, one elder declared coldly, that the resonant host has been defiled. Another voice cut through the hush. She must be cleansed, her body recycled, the hybrid erased. But Leora did not bow. Instead, she stepped forward, slow, deliberate, and set Talon gently in the center of the circle. The child blinked up at the elders, his greenish skin glowing faintly in the frigid light. Then he raised his tiny hands, and the impossible happened. The crystals surrounding them, every pillar, every ancient stone, every buried relic of the temple, began to sing. A luminous pulse erupted, violet and white, spiraling upward in sacred patterns unseen for centuries. Light danced over the frozen ground, across the walls, into the heavens themselves. Thalin was not corrupted. He was harmonic, the perfect fusion of human will and alien divinity. Silence fell. One by one, the elders dropped to their knees. Even the oldest among them whispered in awe. She awakened the root song. We could not achieve that in 10 generations. Tears glistened in Leora's eyes as she lifted Thalin back into her arms. She turned to them, her voice steady yet breaking. You told me I was too big to be pure, too flawed to create life. Her gaze swept to Kale, standing at her side, then down at the child who glowed brighter with every breath. She looked back at the circle of elders, defiant. Then tell me, why does this little one sing with my voice and his light? The sky above had already shifted. Where once only pale blue and frost ruled the horizon, now streaks of violet shimmered, veins of new life pulsing across the heavens. The resonance pillars no longer stood dormant. They glowed in harmony, singing the name of the child who was never meant to exist. On the highest edge of the temple grounds, she stood tall and unarmored at last. Her silver hair whipped in the wind, her glowing skin gleaming against the cold she no longer felt, radiant. At her side stood Kale, his hand wrapped firmly around her thick wrist, and their child cradled between them, giggling, pulsing with the light of two species finally in sync. Below them, the disciples and elders of the BioArch knelt, not in submission, but in reverence. They had not witnessed corruption. They had witnessed balance. Leora looked down at her body, the one they once called too big, too wrong, too divine to be touched, and she saw what it held now, a child in one arm and a lover in the other. She spoke softly, her voice carrying across the arena. I used to wonder if I was made for anything more than ceremony. She turned to Kale then, and he smiled at her like sunrise breaking ice. You carried our world, he said, and gave it back brighter. She lowered her head and kissed him, slow, soft, sure. The kind of kiss that said, you freed me, not by worship, but by touch. Thalen cooed in her arms, glowing brighter still, his laughter mingling with the wind. And the woman who was once untouchable stepped down from her pedestal, not as a goddess, not as a vessel, but as a mate, a mother, a beginning. They told her she was too big to be loved, too divine to be touched. But one human defied gods and traditions and held her like a woman, not a symbol. If you believe love can rewrite even the oldest laws, tell us below. Was she cursed by her size or chosen because of it? Don't forget to subscribe for more stories where humanity doesn't conquer galaxies, it heals them.